The Rainbow Tower. Written by Alex Tymms. Illustrated by R H Stewart. Episode 6. Indigo. "Trevor!" Jed yelled. "Mrs. F!" Jed was down on his front, his face pressed into the crack in the marble floor tiles. "Trevor!" He strained to hear, but there was no reply. Plus he couldn't see beyond the tangle of steel rods and reinforcing mesh that had been exposed when the concrete floor slab had broken. Jed jumped to his feet, sending a huge cloud of dust billowing up from the floor. He ran to where the crack was wider, his footsteps being the only ones in the whole of the dust blanket. He stopped and tried to peer down again. However, the light was so dim beyond the break in the floor compared with the warm yellow glow which bathed where he stood that he couldn't see a thing. He moved on again. "Trevor! Mrs. F!" Had he really heard them? Was this just another example of his mind playing tricks, just like in the pipe? At last, where the crack was widest, he heard someone shouting back. Jed flung himself down and could have shouted for joy when, peering through the debris, he saw 3 pale faces staring up at him. "Jed!" Trevor squinted up into the light. Beside him were Mrs. F and one of the twins. "Jed, it is you! Where are you? What are you doing up there?" Jed grinned back. "Well, I've no idea where I am." Then he remembered. Hang on." Jed pulled the device from his pocket. It had told him he was in the toilets earlier. Maybe it would tell him where he was now. The small rectangle lit up as Jed touched it, revealing a featureless expanse covered in small labels. 2 words leapt out. 2 short and simple words, but ones that made Jed leap up and look behind him. It was the first time he'd looked properly at where he was. A huge, opaque wall from which heat and light flooded into the space was just behind him, and all along the bottom of this wall were doors. "Jed, what is it?" Trevor shouted, concern in his voice. "Jed!" "It's okay," Jed yelled back. He waved the device over the crack as if for Trevor to see. "It says, 'Way out,'" he announced in triumph. "What?" Trevor called back, sounding puzzled. "The way out. I've found the way out." "Don't be stupid. What are you talking about? There's no such thing." Jed was too excited to feel put down by Trevor's disbelief. "I'm in a huge hall of glass. Atrium, it says here." Jed looked up from the device to make sure he was describing the atrium correctly. "It goes up so many stories, I can't count them all, and it's all glass. Glass balconies, glass doors, even glass lifts. Glass lifts! Can you believe that? It's warm too, not like the furnaces in Violet. This is as if I'm covered in warm water but still able to breathe." "Jed, what nonsense!" Jed ignored him. "And the device, Trevor, it works. It tells me where I am, and it says, 'Way out.'" Trevor hesitated. "Are you sure?" Jed sprinted across to the doors, dust flying everywhere. He couldn't see out, but he read what it said on them. He then dashed back to the crack, diving onto his hands and knees. "It says, 'Push bar to open' on them. It has to be." Trevor at last returned Jed's grin. "You clever lad." The grin, however, disappeared as the sounds of screaming came through the opening. "What's that? What's happening?" Jed shouted above the noise. A foul stench filled his nostrils, and he pushed his torso down into the cold crack, completely at odds with the comforting warmth he could feel at the back of his legs. "Trevor!" "It's reached the main transfer lifts to Violet. That lobby was packed with people." Jed could now see Trevor, Mrs. F, and the twin more clearly. They were perched on top of the office cages of Violet's administration section. Jed had never seen them before, but Trevor had described them in one of his education sessions, as he liked to call them. The offices were piled one on top of another, almost to the roof, and accessed by ladders. There was more screaming, this time closer. Jed saw Trevor take hold of the twin. "Up you go, young lady. Hurry. Jed'll look after you." The twin, while looking terrified, didn't even glance back. She scurried into the cat's cradle of wires and bars, threading her way between the broken chunks of concrete. "You too, Betty." Jed had never heard anyone call Mrs. F by her name before, and it seemed very odd. Mrs. F began to climb as well. To the watching Jed, they seemed to take forever to clamber through the 5 metres of slab. The twin wouldn't take Jed's hand as she climbed into the atrium, preferring instead to haul herself out on her own. "Amy, isn't it?" Jed said. She shook her head. "Sorry, Lily." Jed cursed himself inwardly. He never could tell them apart. "Don't worry, the doors are just over there. We'll be out of here in no time." Lily glanced over to the warm wall as Jed leant into the crack to help Mrs. F. Far behind her, Trevor was beginning his climb as the screams were suddenly cut short. If anything, the silence was more terrifying. "Hurry, Trevor!" Jed shouted as he pulled Mrs. F free. The big man had just squeezed into the bottom of the crevice when another blast of foul air sent Jed reeling. There was a tortured metal groan, and he saw the offices give way. The cage, upon which Trevor had been standing only moments before, collapsed. "Come on!" Jed pleaded, as Trevor tried to climb. Jed glanced over his shoulder to find Lily and Mrs. F had gone. The young girl had bolted. She was heading for the doors, with Mrs. F hurrying after her, trying to stop her. It was no good. Lily reached the nearest door and crashed into the bar across it. Blinding light flooded through the opening, along with a rush of warm, sweet air as the door flew away from her. For a split second, it blew the smell of the mass away. Then the wall of stench rolled back, accompanied by a security klaxon from the now open door. More sirens blared out across the atrium. "No!" Jed shouted, and looked down to see that Trevor was in trouble. The big man was stuck. Unlike the other two, he couldn't squeeze through the gaps in the mesh and reinforcing rods, his clothes snagging and tearing on the metal. "Trevor, please!" Jed begged, as more foul air blasted them. Jed lay, stretching down into the crack, but Trevor was too far away. Beneath Jed's stomach, he felt the floor lurch, and around him the blaring alarms continued. He knew that thing was drawn to noise. There was no question. The mass was coming for them. Thank you very much for listening to The Rainbow Tower. To see more of R H Stewart's excellent artwork, you'll find him on Instagram at roy.hootson.stewart. For Alex Tymms, why not try the novel OutCaste at ao3.com? Or, for something completely different, check out the Amier series on YouTube or at amier.com, also by Alex Tymms.